Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of those stories you probably won't survive without feeling something deep in your chest. It's about family pride and the quiet ways humiliation can taste sweeter or bitterer than any meal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. I remember that night like the smell of burnt garlic, sharp, heavy, impossible to forget. My daughter had invited me to their new house, all modern and cold, full of chrome and echo. I'd spent the whole day cooking. My hands trembled as I carried the pot inside the same one I'd used since she was a child. It was my signature dish braised beef with caramelized onions and lemongrass, the kind that filled every corner of our old home with warmth. I thought it would remind her of childhood, of safety. Instead, it became the weapon for my first humiliation. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair when he saw it. "Wow," he said, his grin too wide. "Smells rustic." The way he said rustic, like a museum exhibit, not a meal, made my stomach tighten. He poked the beef with a fork as if he were testing an alien specimen. My daughter laughed nervously. "Mom loves traditional recipes," she said. "It's her thing." And there it was. The thing, the soft mockery that young people use when they want to sound respectful while pushing you aside. He took one bite, chewed, and tilted his head. "Not bad," he said, for something this old school. The table laughed. Even the kids smirked, following their father's tone like baby ducks learning cruelty. I smiled because mothers-in-law are trained to smile. But I felt that heat behind my eyes, the same kind I used to feel when the oven caught fire, and I had to pretend it was all under control. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to their laughter echo through the thin walls. I wondered when exactly I had become a relic, something to tolerate, not to cherish. People still debate whether modern families lost respect for their elders or whether we elders just refused to adapt. I didn't know the answer, but I knew that in that moment, respect wasn't something you could season back into life once it's been cooked out. Cooking has always been my love language. I once read that scientists found the smell of home-cooked food triggers the same brain activity as a hug. Maybe that's why I spent years feeding people who didn't always deserve it, because love for me had always been edible. I taught my daughter that the secret to flavor wasn't salt or sugar, but patience. You had to wait for the onions to tell you when they were ready. She used to stand beside me watching, learning. But the girl who used to lick sauce off her fingers now lived in a world where everything came in a package. I tried to laugh it off the next morning. "Maybe I overcooked it," I told her as we cleaned the dishes. She didn't look at me. "He's just joking, Mom," she said. "Don't be sensitive." Sensitive, that word again, used like a shield by people who can't feel the depth of what they've broken. I wanted to tell her that I didn't care about his jokes, but I did. Every syllable of his laughter had burned into me, one slow spark at a time. There's a strange cultural ritual in my country. When a daughter gets married, her mother is expected to let go completely. You don't just give her away. You surrender her laughter, her habits, even the smell of her cooking. It's like you hand over your legacy in exchange for silence. People say it's tradition, but to me, it's more like a quiet funeral nobody talks about. Still, I decided I wouldn't let bitterness season my heart. The next time they invited me, I would bring something else, simpler, safer, maybe dessert. I even rehearsed little jokes in the mirror just to show I could be modern, too, because that's what families do, right? They bend, they adapt, they pretend it doesn't hurt. But when I opened my recipe notebook that night, I saw the first stain of doubt spreading across its pages. Not from spilled sauce, but from me wondering whether love that must constantly prove itself is really love at all. You ever notice how pride doesn't announce itself until it's broken? You can live decades thinking you're humble, simple, easy to please, until someone laughs at something you poured your heart into. That night, I realized my pride wasn't about my food. It was about what my food represented, my worth as a mother, my place in their home, my memory still alive in my daughter's life. People still debate whether pride is a sin or a survival instinct. For me, it was a small flame that kept me standing when love turned cold. After that dinner, I couldn't cook for a few days. I'd stand in the kitchen staring at the shelves, unable to pick up a single spice jar. The scent of garlic made me nauseous. My husband used to say, "When you lose your appetite, it's your soul fasting." Maybe he was right. The kitchen that once buzzed with rhythm, the cutting, stirring, tasting, now felt like a tomb. Even the clock on the wall ticked too loud, as if reminding me that time was eating me alive. I didn't tell anyone, of course. Mothers-in-law don't complain, they adjust. We shrink ourselves to fit into the corners of other people's lives. But that week, even my neighbors noticed I wasn't cooking. Old Mrs. Nguyen next door came over with a bowl of soup. "You're pale," she said. "What happened?" I just smiled. I told her my stomach was upset, which wasn't entirely a lie. She sighed and said something I never forgot. "When they mock your food, they're not mocking your dish, they're mocking your story." That hit hard, because my story was in my cooking. Every flavor had a memory, every recipe a piece of someone I loved. The first time I made braised beef, my husband was a young mechanic coming home late from the shop. I'd wait for him watching the stew simmer, the smell mixing with the oil on his jacket when he hugged me. Later, when my daughter was born, she'd wake up to that same scent. It was never just food, it was our history, written in steam. I remember reading once that in some cultures, recipes are considered sacred inheritances. In Italy, families guard their pasta sauce recipes like family jewels. In Japan, certain miso blends have been passed down for over 2 centuries. And yet here I was being laughed at for doing the same thing, protecting something ancient, something real. Sometimes I wonder if progress has a cruel sense of humor, replacing meaning with convenience and calling it evolution. One evening, I visited my daughter again, this time unannounced. I brought a small basket of herbs from my garden, fresh lemongrass, basil, mint. She opened the door, surprised but polite. "Mom, you should have called," she said, glancing back to see if her husband was home. "He's working late," she added quickly, as if that were a relief. I smiled. "Then it's just us," I said. I wanted to cook with her like old times. But as we stood in that cold, silent kitchen, I realized she didn't even have a wok, just a row of sleek, unused pans hanging like museum pieces. When I reached for the garlic, she stopped me. "Mom, we don't fry things inside anymore. It makes the house smell." I froze my hand mid-air. The house smell. I used to believe that a home should smell of life, of stories, of meals that lingered long after the plates were clean. But this place smelled like lemon disinfectant and new paint. No history, no heart. Just a showroom where love had to look good for guests. We cooked anyway, or tried to. She followed instructions from her phone while I watched my heart quietly cracking. She measured everything with precision, afraid to make mistakes. I used to tell her cooking isn't math, it's music. You have to feel it. But she didn't want to feel. She wanted to control. I stayed silent, though I felt that familiar sting rise in my chest. When we sat down to eat, she smiled awkwardly. "See, Mom? It's not so hard." I nodded, chewing politely. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't alive either. There was no warmth, no personality, just ingredients that met, but never fell in love. That's when I understood she wasn't mocking me because she hated my food. She mocked me because my way of loving embarrassed her. That realization didn't comfort me, it broke me even more. Because I knew deep down that love that embarrasses the young is the kind that eventually saves them. But you can't say that out loud. They just call you dramatic. So I smiled and washed the dishes like always. That night, walking home under the streetlights, I thought of all the women before me who had swallowed their pride behind kitchen doors. My mother once told me a superstition: every tear you cry while cooking adds salt to your next meal. I laughed then. But now I wondered how many dishes I'd ruined that way, how many times I'd flavored love with quiet sorrow. People say food brings families together, but sometimes it's the first thing that exposes the cracks. We think we're fighting over recipes or traditions, but really we're fighting over belonging, who gets to define what home tastes like. As I reached my gate, I could still hear her words. "It makes the house smell." Maybe that's what aging is becoming, the scent that younger generations try to scrub away. But I decided right there that I wouldn't let them erase me so easily. My food might go out of fashion, but my story wouldn't. And I knew one day someone in that house would come looking for the taste of what they'd once rejected. It's strange how a home can divide without anyone raising their voice. One day, you're the mother who knows every spice in the cupboard, and the next, you're just a guest who needs to call first. The distance doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in like humidity warping the wood of relationships until nothing quite fits the way it used to. People still debate whether marriages unite families or split them into polite islands. I think it depends on who's steering the ship, and in my daughter's home, I wasn't even allowed to touch the compass. Weeks passed after that awkward dinner, and I told myself I was over it. But pride has a long shelf life. It doesn't spoil. It ferments. Every time I looked at my hands, rough from years of cooking, I saw the ghost of that smirk on my son-in-law's face. He had the kind of arrogance that came wrapped in politeness, the kind that says thank you, while quietly pushing you off the stage. I could almost admire it if it weren't so sharp. My daughter started visiting less often. She used to come by on Sundays, help me in the garden gossip over tea. Now it was always, we're busy this weekend, Mom, or he's working overtime. I'd smile and tell her I understood, but inside I wondered what had changed. Did my presence embarrass her? Was my little house filled with the smell of old wood and spices too much for her polished life? Maybe she had started believing what her husband joked about, that I was old-fashioned, too sentimental, stuck in the past. Once when she finally stopped by, I noticed she'd lost weight. I served her a bowl of soup, and she said, "We've been eating lighter, more salads, less oil." I tried not to laugh. "Your grandmother used to say oil is what keeps the heart from rusting." She smiled politely as if humoring a child. That's when I realized something had shifted forever. Our conversations used to be full of laughter, but now every word felt like walking barefoot on glass. I read somewhere that when children marry, they don't just gain a spouse, they rewrite their entire definition of family. And sometimes the old family doesn't fit into that new script. I didn't blame her for growing up. But I did blame myself for teaching her that love means making everyone comfortable except yourself. One evening, they invited me over for dinner again. I hesitated, but went hoping maybe things had softened. When I arrived, I noticed right away my daughter wasn't the one cooking. My son-in-law was at the stove wearing an apron that said Master of the Grill. The smell of garlic butter filled the air, but it didn't feel like home. "We're doing something different tonight," he said. "Modern twist on comfort food." I smiled and sat down, trying to ignore how he moved around the kitchen with exaggerated skill, narrating every motion like a TV chef. "You see, the secret to flavor is balance," he said, sprinkling salt like he was performing magic. My daughter clapped playfully. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. The secret to flavor isn't balance, it's memory. But there was no point in saying that. When he finally served the meal, everyone dug in. It was fine. Technically perfect, but soulless, like music played by someone who'd memorized the notes but never felt the song. So he asked, waiting for my approval. I nodded. "It's balanced," I said. The irony didn't miss me, but he smiled proudly, thinking I'd meant it as praise. Later that night, as I helped my daughter clean up, she whispered, "He really wants to impress you, Mom." I looked at her and almost laughed. By mocking me, I asked softly. She sighed. "You just take things too seriously. He jokes with everyone." There it was again, too serious, too emotional, too much, as if age had turned my feelings into an inconvenience. That night, I went home and sat in the dark kitchen. The shadows stretched across the floor like memories I couldn't sweep away. I realized our kitchen divide wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. They cooked for presentation. I cooked for connection. They plated beauty, I plated belonging, and in their world, belonging was out of style. I once read about an inheritance case in Italy where a woman left her entire estate not to her children, but to her family recipes. The court actually honored her wish by creating a culinary trust to preserve them. Some people called her eccentric, others called her brilliant. I understood her completely. She wasn't just protecting recipes, she was protecting her identity from extinction. Maybe that's why I couldn't let go either. After that dinner, I made a quiet decision: if they wouldn't accept my cooking in their home, I would make sure it never left mine uninvited again. From then on, I stopped offering food. When they visited, I served tea, nothing more. And though it hurt, I felt strangely powerful, because sometimes withholding love is the only way to remind people it existed in the first place. Of course, people still debate whether silence heals or destroys families. I didn't have an answer then. But I knew that my silence had started to taste like something new, something sharp, almost like revenge but seasoned with sadness. And deep inside I wondered how long it would take before they noticed what was missing. The funny thing about small neighborhoods is that walls are thin and whispers travel faster than smoke. It didn't take long before the story of the mother-in-law who got mocked at dinner began seasoning the air. I never told anyone what really happened, but somehow stories cook themselves when people are hungry for gossip. I heard pieces of it in the market between the vegetables and the weighing scale. "Did you hear? Her son-in-law doesn't like her food," one woman said. "Poor thing, she used to be such a great cook." Another replied, "Well, Maybe her taste got old like her hands. I smiled politely and walked past, pretending not to hear. But inside, I felt like a pot left too long on the stove, burnt at the bottom, unsalvageable. People still debate whether gossip serves any purpose. Some say it keeps society in check, a way to share moral lessons disguised as stories. Others think it's just cruelty with better lighting. I think it's both a reminder that the world watches your fall more eagerly than your rise. My neighbors had known me for decades. They'd eaten my food during festivals, borrowed my spice blends, even asked me to cater their weddings once upon a time. But now, when I passed by, their smiles had a hint of pity. "You should rest more," one of them said. "You've done enough in life." That phrase, "done enough," sounded like a burial. I hadn't realized society retires women not by law but by quiet dismissal. One evening, I was watering my garden when I overheard laughter from next door. They were talking about a viral video, some influencer making fun of his mother-in-law's traditional cooking and then getting millions of views. "Reminds me of Mrs. Land's situation," one of them said. My hand froze midair. They laughed harder. I put down the watering can and went inside without saying a word. But something inside me started to harden like caramel that had gone too far. That night, I stood in my kitchen, staring at my reflection in the oven door. I barely recognized the woman looking back. She had fine lines etched like recipes across her skin, eyes too tired to sparkle, and lips pressed in permanent restraint. "Maybe they're right," I whispered. "Maybe I am outdated." But then I remembered something my mother once told me when I was a girl. Tradition isn't old, it's a compass. Lose it and you'll wander even when you think you're modern. I didn't want my daughter to wander. Even if she no longer looked back, I wanted the path to still exist when she finally did. So I started cooking again. Quietly. Not for them, for me. Every morning, I'd prepare one small dish, something from memory. Pork simmered in caramel rice steamed with pandan leaves, sweet soup with lotus seeds. The smell filled the house again, soft and forgiving. Neighbors might have whispered, but my kitchen forgave me faster than people ever could. One morning, Mrs. Nguyen came over again. "You're cooking," she said, smiling. "I can smell it halfway down the street." I nodded. For myself this time. She laughed and said, "That's the best audience you'll ever have." Then she sat down and added softly, "But be careful. People hate when old women find peace." It made me think, why is a woman's joy always seen as rebellion? Once she's past a certain age, why do they call it pride when we stand our ground, but love when we give everything away? Society doesn't know what to do with women who stop apologizing, so it gossips. Later that week, something unexpected happened. My daughter dropped by alone. She looked tired, really tired. Her eyes darted around as if checking whether I'd mention her husband. "He's been traveling," she said quickly. I poured her tea, pretending not to notice her avoidance. When she saw the food on the counter, her face softened. "You're cooking again," she said. I smiled. "Always have been." She sat quietly for a moment, then confessed, "He told me I should learn your recipes. He said they're too complex for daily meals." I laughed. "Too complex for people who think flavor comes in packets." She chuckled, then covered her mouth, almost guilty for finding it funny. That small sound, it healed something in me, because it was the first time she'd laughed with me, not at me, in months. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual. "Take care, Mom," she whispered. Her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of soup on the stove. I didn't know what that moment meant yet, but I felt a quiet shift. Maybe the wind was finally changing direction. Still, as I watched her drive away, I couldn't shake the thought that my story had already escaped me, that it now lived in other people's mouths, twisted and retold. But maybe that was okay. After all, stories like recipes only survive if they're passed on. Even gossip in its ugly way keeps you alive in people's minds. That night, I closed my windows against the noise, but not before hearing one last whisper through the wall. "She's still cooking, you know. Some people never learn." I smiled to myself and whispered back to no one. Some people never forget. Everyone thinks the secret ingredient is something you can buy. A spice, a sauce, maybe some exotic oil hidden in the back of a pantry. But the truth is, my secret ingredient was something no one could bottle: grief. It's a strange flavor, subtle but unmistakable. Once it enters your cooking, it never leaves. People still debate whether sorrow can deepen a person or just make them bitter. I think it depends on what you do with it, whether you stir it in or choke on it. My recipes weren't born from luxury, but from loss. During the war, when I was a child, food wasn't something you chose, it was something you prayed for. My mother used to say, hunger teaches you creativity faster than any cookbook. We lived in a small village where the rivers ran muddy, and rice was sometimes stretched with roasted banana stems just to feed everyone. I remember her standing by a clay stove boiling scraps of bone into soup, humming softly to keep me calm. Even now, decades later, whenever I simmer broth, I still hear that tune, an unspoken promise that love can survive starvation. That's the real secret I carry into every dish endurance, the kind that doesn't look pretty, but keeps you alive. When my son-in-law mocked my food, he wasn't just mocking my taste. He was mocking generations of survival disguised as flavor. He didn't know that the beef stew he called too heavy once kept my family warm when there was no electricity, that the fish sauce he joked smelled too strong was the only seasoning my mother had when salt ran out. One night, I decided to open my old recipe box, the one wrapped in faded newspaper. Inside were scraps of paper, oil-stained and brittle, each with my mother's looping handwriting. Caramelize the sugar until it turns the color of old copper, one note read. Another said, if you cry while cutting onions, the dish will taste sweeter. I smiled through tears. My mother was gone, but in those recipes, she was still teaching me how to live. I started copying them into a notebook carefully, slowly. I didn't just write measurements, I wrote memories. Add 1 tablespoon of patience. Stir clockwise when you're angry. It calms the sauce. Taste with your heart, not your tongue. I wasn't preserving recipes, I was preserving a lineage of invisible women who fed their families while the world ignored them. I read an article once about how UNESCO protects intangible heritage, things like folk songs, dances, and yes, even recipes. It said preserving these isn't just about culture, it's about keeping people from vanishing. I thought of my mother, her hands burned from firewood, her voice soft but firm, saying, never let them forget how we survived. Maybe this was my version of that vow. The next time my daughter came over, I gave her the notebook. These are our family recipes, I said. They're yours now. She flipped through the pages, half interested, until she saw the handwriting. Is this Grandma's? She whispered. I nodded. For a moment, the distance between us melted. She smiled, truly, smiled and said, I'll read them later. I knew she wouldn't at least not right away, but it didn't matter. Because one day, when life bruises her pride the way it did mine, she'll reach for those pages desperate for something that feels like home. That night, as I cooked for myself, I noticed how light my heart felt. I realized that the real secret ingredient wasn't just endurance or love, it was forgiveness. Forgiveness for a world that moves too fast to taste, for a generation that confuses novelty with improvement, and for myself, for letting their laughter hurt me so deeply. I laughed quietly when I thought about it, me the old lady everyone whispered about still here, stirring her pots like a stubborn ghost. There's a superstition that says, if you cook with resentment, your food will curdle no matter how fresh the ingredients. Maybe that's why my last few dishes had tasted off, not because I'd lost skill, but because I'd let bitterness season my soul. So I decided to stop cooking with resentment. I'd cook with memory instead. One day, Mrs. Nguyen stopped by again and asked, why do your dishes always smell so rich? I told her. Because I cook with people, not ingredients. She frowned. What do you mean? I smiled. Every meal I make, I imagine who it's for, even if they're gone. She laughed softly, but later she told me she started doing the same, and her husband said her soups had never been better. That's the magic of food. It connects you to people who no longer sit at your table. It carries voices, laughter, even arguments through flavor. My son-in-law could mock my cooking all he wanted, but he'd never understand that kind of depth. You can't learn it from recipes on a phone screen. You have to live it, lose it, and live again. I ended that week with a new kind of peace. I no longer wanted revenge, only remembrance, because someday when I'm gone, they'll find that notebook, and maybe, just maybe, they'll realize every recipe was also a letter to them from me, and in that realization, they'll finally taste what they once mocked. It was supposed to be just a small barbecue, a friendly weekend gathering with laughter, sunshine, and the smell of grilled meat filling the air. My daughter had invited me to join the fun as she said over the phone, her voice overly bright. I hesitated, remembering the last few times I'd been there, but she insisted. He promised to behave this time, she said, trying to sound reassuring. I smiled faintly, not believing her, but not wanting to argue either. People still debate whether second chances heal or simply reopen old wounds. I decided to find out. When I arrived, the yard was already full. My son-in-law stood by the grill, surrounded by his friends' men, his age loud and confident, holding beers like trophies. My daughter fluttered around them, laughing too hard at every joke. I felt like I'd walked into a movie I wasn't invited to star in. "Hey, the chef's mom-in-law is here," one of the men called out, grinning. My son-in-law looked up, smiled that same smooth smile, and said, "The legend herself." The word legend sounded like a polite insult, and everyone laughed. I handed him a small tray of spring rolls I'd made, hoping it might break the ice. "Thought I'd bring something to share," I said. He looked at them, then chuckled. "Oh, homemade, huh? Brave move. Hope no one gets too nostalgic." The others laughed again. My daughter gave me an awkward smile, like someone trying to apologize with her eyes. I forced a laugh. "Don't worry," I said softly. I boiled the memories out this time. A few people chuckled politely, not realizing I wasn't joking. They put my spring rolls on the table, but didn't touch them at first. Everyone was too busy praising the grilled ribs and fancy sauces. I sat quietly at the corner of the patio, pretending to enjoy the noise. I noticed the way people spoke about food. Now everything was about trends: keto, gluten-free, low-carb. Food wasn't love anymore. It was performance. I missed the days when a good dish meant full stomachs and shared silence, not hashtags and plating aesthetics. Then midway through the meal, one of his friends had an idea. "Let's play a game," he said, slapping the table. "Blind taste test. The winner guesses the secret ingredient." They cheered. My son-in-law grinned. "Perfect. Let's start with my special marinade. And maybe," he glanced at me, "one of Mom's classics." My daughter's eyes widened. "Honey, no." But it was too late. The challenge had been issued. The crowd chanted, "Yes! Yes!" I watched as he took one of my spring rolls, sliced it dramatically, and handed it to his friend. "All right, taste it. Guess the magic." His tone was playful but sharp. The man chewed thoughtfully and said soy sauce. "Maybe too much ginger." Another guessed. Something burnt. Laughter erupted. My face burned hotter than the grill behind him. He laughed too and said, "Maybe it's just nostalgia." They all laughed again, that same cruel music I'd heard before. My daughter stood frozen, torn between embarrassment and fear of confrontation. I smiled. It was the only weapon I had left. "Well," I said, rising slowly, "you're close. The secret ingredient is time." The laughter died down. I looked around the table and added, "It's what makes flavor deepen. And people grow up." Silence. Only the hiss of the grill broke the moment. My son-in-law's face tightened, unsure if I'd insulted him or not. I didn't give him the satisfaction of clarity. I just patted his shoulder lightly and walked toward the kitchen. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the window. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from being misunderstood by people you love. It's heavier than loneliness because it carries disappointment too. I realized I'd been trying to feed people who weren't hungry for what I had to give. Maybe that was my mistake. After a while, my daughter came in. Her face was pale. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she whispered. They didn't mean, I cut her off gently. "He meant it," I said. "He always does. But that's okay." She looked at me, confused. "How can you be so calm?" I smiled. "Because I finally understand something. Every generation has to mock what came before to feel modern, but time humbles everyone eventually, even him." Later, as I left, I passed by the grill again. He looked at me, unsure whether to speak. I handed him the remaining tray of spring rolls and said, "Keep them. Maybe someday you'll figure out the flavor." Then I walked away. I didn't look back, but I heard one of his friends say, "Man, I think she just roasted you harder than your ribs." The laughter this time wasn't cruel. It was nervous. Driving home, I felt a strange peace. Maybe humiliation was just another form of seasoning, adding depth to the soul. People often say revenge is best served cold, but I disagreed. I thought it was best served quietly when the person you're forgiving doesn't even realize you've stopped caring. That night, I wrote a note in my recipe journal, "Never cook for mockery, cook for memory." And beneath it, I added one more line: "The cruelest games are the ones people play without knowing they've already lost." After that barbecue, I made a decision that changed everything. I began compiling all my recipes, not just the ingredients or steps, but the stories behind them. Each dish became a page in a living journal of our family history. I wanted my daughter to inherit more than flavors. I wanted her to inherit memory endurance and the subtle lessons each meal taught. People still debate whether food can teach morality or just survival. But in my kitchen, the lines blurred. Every recipe carried a choice, every seasoning a subtle philosophy. I started with my mother's old staples, the ones that survived wartime rationing: pickled vegetables, slow-cooked soups, caramelized fish. Each dish brought back the smell of our old home, of firewood smoke and herbal aromas mixing in the corners of a small, crowded kitchen. I wrote about how we stretched a pound of meat into several meals and how the right combination of herbs could make even the simplest ingredients feel luxurious. Cooking wasn't just practical, it was an art of survival and joy intertwined. My own recipes followed, and I began numbering them like chapters in a life story. Recipe number 1, resilient soup, I wrote, explaining the patience it required and the memory it carried. Recipe number 2, lemongrass chicken, noting how the scent evoked afternoon light streaming into the kitchen and laughter echoing across tiled floors. Each recipe contained more than ingredients, it contained life, love, and a quiet defiance against forgetfulness. I included notes for my daughter: if someone mocks this, remember the hands that made it, the hearts that waited, the stories folded into every stir. I laughed quietly as I wrote that last line, realizing it sounded like a spell. And in a way, it was. These recipes weren't just food, they were enchantments, binding the past, present, and future into something tangible. I found that writing them down changed me, too. The act of recording memory gave me power I hadn't felt in years. My kitchen no longer felt like a stage for mockery, but like a sanctuary for reflection. I could measure out love in tablespoons, patience in minutes, and forgiveness in pinches of salt. Oddly, it felt more potent than any argument or confrontation could ever be. I read about a custom in some regions of Vietnam where family recipes are never given freely. They're handed down secretly, often in code or hidden in personal journals. Only those deemed ready can inherit them. I smiled, realizing that I had unconsciously adopted this practice. Perhaps it was my way of protecting our heritage, ensuring that my daughter truly valued what she received. Some argue such secrecy is unnecessary in modern life, but I believe that mystery made the knowledge sacred. One evening, my daughter wandered into the kitchen while I was copying a particularly old recipe. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked softly, curiosity lighting her features. I looked up, surprised, and smiled. "I'm writing a book," I said, exaggerating slightly. She frowned. "A cookbook," I nodded. "Partly. Mostly a memory book. For you." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she placed a hand on my shoulder and said I didn't realize how much you wanted me to know. That brief connection felt more nourishing than any meal I'd ever prepared. I realized that these recipes weren't just my legacy. They were a bridge back to the love I once felt effortlessly shared. Every page of the notebook carried a whisper of my mother, my daughter's childhood, and my silent resilience. I could imagine her reading it years later, perhaps after I was gone, finally understanding the patience, the endurance, the subtle joys embedded in every step. Writing the recipes also gave me perspective on my son-in-law. The more I documented, the less anger I felt. His mockery became a lesson rather than a wound. I began imagining a future where he might try to recreate a dish, believing he had mastered it, only to find that something vital, perhaps a pinch of memory, a sprinkle of patience, was missing. I didn't hope to humiliate him. I simply trusted that life had a way of teaching lessons subtly. Finally, I added one last section, a list of small personal notes. "Add laughter generously," I wrote. "Stir arguments away, fold in forgiveness, serve warm." These were instructions for life disguised as cooking advice. I smiled at the thought. Maybe someday my daughter, or even my son-in-law, would stumble upon this wisdom and understand that the secret ingredient had never been about food. It had been about sustaining a family's heart through all of life's bitter and sweet moments. And so the recipe book grew thick with pages and stories. Each time I opened it, I smelled the past, tasted resilience, and felt the unbroken line of women who had taught me to nurture through creation. This book became my quiet rebellion, my way of taking back authority in a household where I had once felt invisible. It was no longer just about cooking, it was about claiming my story one dish at a time. Life has a way of shifting the tables when you least expect it. My son-in-law, the same man who once laughed at my cooking, suddenly found himself hungry in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just physical hunger, though, that was part of it. It was the kind that gnaws at your pride, the subtle emptiness that comes from realizing the world isn't built entirely around you. People still debate whether pride protects the soul or starves it, but in his case, it seemed to do both at once. He had lost his job at the marketing firm. The details were messy budget cuts, restructuring, and an unfortunate timing with a high-profile campaign that went south. I heard about it from my daughter, who called me in the quiet of the evening. Her voice was subdued, almost hesitant, as though she didn't want to admit it to herself. "Mom, things aren't perfect," she said. I understood exactly what she meant. It was one of those moments when your child, suddenly carries the weight of someone else's failures. I didn't scold her. I didn't give advice. I just listened, and the pause between her words felt like a slow, aching acknowledgement of reality. That night, I prepared a simple meal, not my elaborate braised beef or caramelized fish, just rice with some vegetables and a few pieces of chicken. I set it on the table alone, letting the aroma fill my small kitchen. Cooking for myself had become a ritual, almost meditative. I savored the quiet, the routine, and the subtle knowledge that life's flavors were sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, but always worth tasting carefully. A few days later, my daughter arrived, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. "Mom," she whispered, he's back. He wants something." I already knew what that meant, and I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Pride, I reminded myself, is a slow cooking pot. It doesn't extinguish easily. But hunger is quicker. It demands attention. I kept my hands busy chopping onions and stirring oil in the pan while she lingered in the doorway. Her hesitation reminded me of how careful we are around those we love when they've disappointed us. She was afraid, I think, of me, not of anger, but of judgment. And maybe that was fair. I had spent years perfecting the art of love and discipline through food. Now it was their turn to taste it. He arrived quietly later that evening. No bravado, no smirk, just a man carrying the weight of circumstance. His clothes were modest, the carefully ironed shirts replaced with simple, slightly worn sweaters. There was humility in his posture that had been absent for years, a softening of edges that came with vulnerability. I watched him step into my kitchen, and I could almost see him tasting my memory through the air. The smell of garlic lemongrass and simmering chicken filled the room like an invisible invitation. "I heard you're cooking again," he said cautiously. His voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of mockery, stripped of performance. He wasn't asking permission. He was asking sustenance. Hunger finally had taught him humility. I didn't respond immediately. I continued chopping, measuring, stirring. There's a certain power in silence, I reminded myself, the quiet authority of someone who has nurtured life while others played games. The heat of the pan mirrored the tension in the room. I could see him fidget slightly, trying to find the right words, knowing they might not matter as much as the food I was preparing. We ate in silence at first. He tried to make conversation small talk about the weather, his job search, the mundane failures that feel like mountains when you're unsteady. I listened, nodding, but my focus remained on the simple act of feeding. Every bite was a subtle lesson: patience, humility, memory, endurance. He ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, and I could see recognition flicker in his eyes, the realization that some flavors aren't learned through imitation or instructions, but through respect for their origin. That night after the meal, he lingered at the table. "Mom," he said, finally, almost shyly, "would you maybe teach me some of this?" He didn't say your recipe with arrogance. He asked for guidance, like a student approaching a teacher. Pride mixed with desperation is a strange aroma, and I inhaled it carefully. I smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through me. Not triumph, not revenge, just a quiet satisfaction. Hunger, after all, teaches lessons that laughter never can. He had tasted not just food, but patience, endurance, and love disguised as routine. These were ingredients that couldn't be mimicked, only internalized. Over the next few weeks, I began teaching him. Not every day, but sometimes quietly in the morning, showing him how to cut herbs, how to balance flavors, how to listen to the pan rather than his phone. I noticed that he began to change, not dramatically, but subtly. His smirk softened into concentration, his sarcasm into questions. I reminded him that cooking is not about perfection, but presence. People still debate whether cooking is art or labor, but in that tiny kitchen it was both, and more importantly, it was a mirror. He asked questions I never thought he would. Why do you stir clockwise? Why let the onions brown instead of boil them? Each query peeled away years of mockery, revealing curiosity, even respect. I answered honestly, weaving the lessons of my mother, my childhood, and my own triumphs over scarcity into every instruction. These weren't just cooking tips, they were moral and emotional frameworks disguised as culinary advice. One day, he tried to replicate my braised beef. It wasn't perfect, but it carried the essence. I tasted it, and the flavors were familiar yet different, slightly awkward in execution, but earnest. I realized then that the goal wasn't for him to perfectly recreate my dishes, but to understand the heart behind them. That realization softened something in me I hadn't admitted was still tense, the lingering memory of his laughter at that first dinner. Hunger had become a teacher, and I finally a patient mentor rather than a mother humiliated. Through this process, my daughter observed quietly. She started to reconnect with the kitchen, sometimes helping, sometimes watching. It was as if a bridge was being rebuilt, not with words, but with shared labor and flavor. The house began to smell differently, less like performance, more like history, presence, and connection. I could feel the subtle shift in family dynamics, the quiet healing that occurs when pride is tempered by necessity. Of course, he still had moments of awkwardness, reminders that old habits die slowly. He'd glance at my techniques and wonder if shortcuts were possible or joke lightly testing boundaries. But I didn't react. Patience was now my seasoning, and it held more weight than sarcasm ever could. People often debate whether generosity is strength or weakness, but I had discovered it was both seasoned with discernment. Weeks turned into months, and with each meal the tension eased. He learned to respect not just the recipes, but the history and care embedded in them. He began to replicate the smaller dishes, first vegetable stews, simple stir-fries before attempting the more complex meals, and each time he succeeded, I saw something shift in him: humility, attentiveness, and a subtle appreciation of the labor behind flavors he once dismissed. Finally, the day came when he prepared a full meal on his own, serving it to the family. The dish was competent, respectful of the flavors I had taught him, yet marked by his own slight imperfections. My daughter beamed proud of her husband, and the bridge between generations finally repaired. And I, standing in the corner of the kitchen, realized that hunger had not only taught him humility, but reminded me of the enduring power of patience, memory, and quiet persistence. By the end of that day, I understood the secret ingredient had never been a spice or technique. It was the combination of time, patience, memory, and endurance. Hunger had made him receptive. Experience had made him attentive, and respect finally made him a student rather than a critic. My kitchen had transformed from a battlefield into a classroom where lessons were served alongside steaming bowls, and every bite was an education in empathy, humility, and familial bonds. It happened on an ordinary evening. My daughter had just returned from work tired, and my son-in-law lingered in the doorway longer than usual. I sensed the change in the air, the subtle hesitation in his gait, the quiet weight behind his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had laughed at my cooking months ago. Hunger and circumstance had humbled him, but there was more than that. Now there was curiosity, and perhaps even respect, carefully wrapped in pride. People still debate whether true change comes from suffering or self-reflection, but in this case, it was a mixture of both. He cleared his throat and for the first time in years spoke without sarcasm. "Mom," he said, and his voice wavered slightly, I want to learn your recipe." I froze mid-stir. My hands, which had become so accustomed to routine, paused as if the ingredients themselves were waiting for my response. It wasn't a demand, nor was it a casual curiosity. There was an almost reverent quality in the way he said it, a recognition that what I had offered in the past was not just food, but a legacy. I studied him carefully. Pride, I realized, is a fragile thing, especially when confronted by necessity. He'd eaten my meals, often silently, craving the comfort he once mocked, and now he was asking permission to hold a piece of my history in his hands. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I gestured toward the kitchen table where my recipe notebook lay open, pages full of ink stains, smudged lines, and subtle notes that only someone paying attention could understand. "Are you sure you're ready for it?" I asked. It was not a challenge. It was a measure of readiness. He nodded solemnly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied. That was the moment I realized that hunger, humility, and time had finally combined to create an opportunity for genuine learning, a rare chance for respect to replace ridicule. We began that evening with something simple, a small vegetable stew, deceptively plain, yet requiring patience and precise timing. I guided him through every step, washing the vegetables, cutting them carefully, stirring slowly, letting the aromas develop fully before seasoning. Each motion was a lesson not just in technique, but in attentiveness. Cooking isn't just about the dish, I explained, it's about listening to it. Every ingredient has something to say if you're willing to pay attention. He followed meticulously, asking questions when necessary. "Why do we let the onions sweat first?" he inquired. "Because they need time to release their flavor," I said. "Rushing it would rob the dish of depth. Patience is a flavor in itself." He nodded slowly, absorbing not just the steps, but the philosophy embedded within them. I realized then that learning to cook my recipe was also learning to respect the life and experiences that shaped it. Over the next few weeks, our evenings together became a ritual. He would arrive home, and instead of sitting in front of the television or scrolling through his phone, he would join me in the kitchen. We didn't speak much at first. The work itself demanded attention. Chopping, stirring, tasting, these were acts of humility and presence. I noticed a subtle change in him. His movements, once hasty and performative, became deliberate, careful. His questions, once sarcastic or teasing, became genuine, seeking understanding rather than validation. One evening, he attempted my signature braised beef, the dish that had once been the scene of my humiliation. He followed the recipe meticulously, adding ingredients at the precise moments, adjusting the heat, with care, smelling, tasting, correcting, and finally plating it with pride. I watched silently, letting him discover the joy of creation on his own, only intervening when necessary. When he finally served it to the family, the room was quiet. Everyone took a bite, eyes widening at the familiar yet slightly altered flavors. My daughter looked at me, a mixture of pride and surprise in her eyes. "He did it," she whispered. "He really did it." I smiled softly. He had not only replicated the dish, he had understood it, internalized it, and added his own patience and care. It was a subtle transformation, but significant. After dinner, I sat alone in the kitchen while he cleaned the dishes. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly, "not just for teaching me, but for letting me try." I nodded. "Cooking is a gift, but it's also a responsibility," I said. "It teaches respect not just for food, but for the hands, hearts, and histories that feed it." He seemed to understand, and for the first time I felt the bridge between us solid and unbroken. The following week he asked for another recipe, a dessert my mother had perfected long ago. We worked together to create a delicate lotus seed pudding, stirring, folding, and tasting. He made mistakes, of course, too much sugar, a slightly lumpy texture, but each error was met with guidance rather than ridicule. Slowly he learned the subtle art of patience and precision. Cooking, he realized, was not about speed or showmanship. It was about respect, memory, and attention. As the weeks turned into months, his confidence grew. He began attempting recipes on his own, sometimes experimenting with minor adjustments, sometimes attempting a full replication. Each time he would seek my guidance, but not because he doubted himself, because he understood that mastery is a continuous process of observation, practice, and humility. The man who once mocked my cooking had become a student, and in the process, he had learned to appreciate not just the flavors, but the history, care, and love embedded within each dish. Through this process, my daughter observed quietly. She occasionally helped, but more often she watched and absorbed the atmosphere, the soft rhythm of our movements, the attentive silence punctuated by gentle conversation, the subtle joy of creation shared across generations. It was as if a family ritual had been restored not through coercion or guilt, but through shared effort and respect. One evening, after a particularly complex meal, he said, "I think I finally understand why you get upset when people mock your food." I nodded slowly. It's not the food itself, it's the history, the care, and the love that goes into it. Those aren't things you can imitate. They have to be felt. He smiled faintly, a mixture of realization and humility. That smile, quiet and unassuming, was a gift more nourishing than any dish we had prepared. The change in him wasn't immediate, nor was it dramatic. There were still moments of impatience, minor slips into sarcasm, or awkward gestures. But the underlying shift was undeniable. He had moved from a critic to a learner, from a mocker to a participant, and in doing so, he had reconnected with a deeper sense of family tradition and respect. Eventually, he asked to document the recipes himself, taking notes, writing down tips, and recording the subtle lessons I had imparted. It became a joint project, one that required patience, attention, and careful observation. Through this shared effort, we rebuilt the bonds that had frayed layer by layer, dish by dish. Looking back, I understood that the recipe request had been more than a culinary curiosity. It was a turning point. It was a moment when humility, hunger, and genuine interest intersected, creating a path for reconciliation, understanding, and mutual respect. The dish he once ridiculed had become a vessel for growth, teaching him the value of patience, attentiveness, and acknowledgement of history. In teaching him, I had also taught my daughter, who watched closely, about the enduring power of patience, forgiveness, and mentorship. The kitchen, once a battlefield of pride and mockery, had transformed into a classroom, a sanctuary, and a space for generational learning. And the most remarkable realization of all was this: the secret ingredient had never been a spice, a technique, or a clever trick. It had always been presence, attention, and love, quietly simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be tasted and understood. The reunion was set on a bright Saturday morning, with sunlight spilling into the backyard and casting long shadows across the polished wooden deck. My daughter had insisted we all gather to celebrate her recent promotion and the apparent stability my son-in-law had achieved after months of struggle. I watched the scene unfold from my spot near the herb garden, quietly observing the dynamics that had shifted so subtly over the past year. People still debate whether true reconciliation is instantaneous or gradual, but in this household, I had witnessed patience bend the stubbornest hearts into shape. I noticed immediately that my son-in-law had taken on the role of host, arranging dishes on the table with precision and care. There was pride in his posture, but it was different now, tempered with humility, respect, and I suspect a lingering understanding of what he had once dismissed. I approached the table carrying a small tray of lotus seed pudding, a recipe my mother had perfected and that I had passed to him months ago. The aroma was familiar, comforting, and immediately evocative of our shared lessons in the kitchen. He noticed me and smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey we had traveled together. "Mom," he said, "I hope I did justice to the recipes you taught me." I nodded, my expression unreadable. It wasn't about approval or praise. It was about recognition that the dish, like our relationship, had been nurtured slowly with care and attention. The table was crowded with friends, family, and neighbors, all of whom had come to witness a casual celebration, unaware of the subtle drama simmering beneath the surface. As we sat down, he began serving the main course, the braised beef that had been the scene of my initial humiliation. He plated it carefully, the caramelized onions glistening, the lemongrass scent curling into the air like a gentle memory. People murmured appreciatively, noting the flavors, the presentation, and the evident skill involved. My daughter watched him with a mixture of pride and curiosity, as if finally understanding the depth of what had transpired in our small kitchen over the past months. I took my first bite and immediately noticed the difference. The flavors were accurate, yet slightly altered, infused with his own understanding, his attentive care, and perhaps, most importantly, humility. There was a trace of imperfection, subtle but intentional, that demonstrated he had internalized the lessons rather than merely replicating the recipe. I observed the expressions around the table, surprise, admiration, and a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had shifted. But then, as he placed a piece on my daughter's plate, I caught the first sign of error, a missing pinch of salt here, a slight overcooking there. It was minor, almost imperceptible, yet glaring to someone who knew the dish intimately. I saw the subtle tension flicker in my daughter's eyes. She knew that the authenticity of my cooking carried more than taste. It carried history, patience, and a lineage of women who had perfected these dishes through hardship. And here it was, slightly altered, not intentionally disrespectful, but incomplete. I decided not to intervene immediately. Sometimes silence communicates more than correction. As we continued eating, I noticed a change in my son-in-law. He shifted subtly in his seat, his posture tightening, the faint furrow in his brow, betraying awareness that something essential was missing. He had attempted the dish, he had served it proudly, but he hadn't yet understood the final nuance, the secret ingredient that could not be written down, measured, or demonstrated. That evening, I finally spoke softly so only he could hear. "You did well," I said, "but there's something missing." He glanced at me, curious, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "What's that?" he asked quietly. I gestured subtly to the dish before him, the heart behind it, the patience, the memory, the understanding of every hand that touched these ingredients before yours. His eyes widened slightly, a mixture of realization and humility washing over him. It was in that moment that the family observed something remarkable. My daughter, sitting nearby, finally seemed to understand the depth of what had occurred in our kitchen. She had witnessed the journey from mockery to humility, from disinterest to engagement, but she had not fully grasped the nuances of the emotional labor involved until now. She smiled quietly, knowing that the reconciliation was not merely between mother and son-in-law, but among all three of us, threaded through the delicate language of food. I noticed a subtle shift in the room. Conversations once casual and distracted became more attentive. Neighbors and friends sampled the dishes with newfound respect, noting the complexity and balance. My son-in-law's pride was tempered with humility, his service of the dishes now an act of respect rather than performance. The meal had become a testament not merely to culinary skill, but to emotional intelligence, patience, and the transformative power of attentiveness. Later, as dessert was served, the lotus seed pudding, I observed the final layer of understanding. My son-in-law had attempted it independently without guidance, relying on memory and intuition. The texture was slightly firmer than I would have preferred, the sweetness just a touch off balance. Yet the flavor carried something deeper, the labor of reflection, the humility of learning, and the silent acknowledgement of history embedded in every bite. I realized then that mastery was not perfection, but the integration of knowledge, empathy, and patience. I could see the internal transformation taking place within him. The man who had once ridiculed me was now capable of reverence. His pride, once his shield, had been replaced with curiosity and attentiveness. The meal was no longer a performance. It was a dialogue, a living narrative of reconciliation. And in that narrative, I recognized my own journey from humiliation to patience, from doubt to quiet authority. As the gathering continued, conversations shifted. Neighbors commented on the flavors, friends praised the presentation, and my daughter shared anecdotes of our lessons in the kitchen. The room was alive with engagement, connection, and subtle joy. Yet amidst the celebration, I noticed the lingering tension, the small, almost imperceptible awareness that the final essence, the intangible heart of the dishes, remained elusive. It was a subtle reminder that some elements of mastery and legacy cannot be taught in a single meal or event. After the guests departed, we lingered in the quiet of the kitchen. My son-in-law approached me slightly hesitant, and I think I understand what you meant, he said softly. It's not just the ingredients, is it? It's everything else, the history, the patience, the presence. I nodded, smiling faintly. Exactly. And now that you know, it's your responsibility to honor it, not just replicate it. He looked down, contemplative, absorbing the weight of the moment. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in our household. Conversations became more thoughtful, attentiveness replaced casual dismissal, and even small gestures like setting the table or preparing tea carried newfound respect. The dishes he prepared were no longer merely food. They were lessons in humility, patience, and understanding imbued with the intangible qualities that had been absent in his initial attempts. The taste of regret had not disappeared completely, but it had been transformed into something constructive. My son-in-law had tasted the cost of mockery, the depth of patience required to truly understand a tradition, and the value of attention to detail. He had learned that the heart behind a dish could not be replicated without respect, memory, and care. And through this understanding, he had begun to reconcile not only with me, but with the history, effort, and love embedded in our family's culinary legacy. Looking back, I realized that the taste of regret is not a punishment, but a teacher. It sharpens perception, cultivates humility, and encourages attentiveness. My son-in-law had experienced this firsthand, not through scolding, not through confrontation, but through the subtle, persistent insistence of history, labor, and love served patiently on a plate. People still debate whether food can carry moral lessons, but in that moment, the answer was unmistakable. That evening, as I cleaned the kitchen alone, I reflected on the journey from ridicule to reverence. Every dish, every stir, every conversation had built a bridge between generations, transforming humiliation into respect, impatience into understanding, and pride into humility. And as I washed the last pan, I realized that the true reward was not the perfect replication of a recipe, but the quiet, enduring acknowledgement that effort, patience, and love leave an indelible mark on those who are willing to learn. The house is quiet now, the laughter and chatter of the reunion fading into memory. I sit at the kitchen table, tracing the lines of my recipe notebook with gentle fingers, letting the pen rest where ink has already dried. The aromas of the last meal linger faintly, a soft echo of labor, patience, and love. I think about how far we've come, not just the dishes, not just the skills, but the subtle transformation in hearts and relationships. Sometimes family doesn't heal in obvious ways. Sometimes the lessons are quiet, embedded in smells, textures, and the unspoken language of effort. I look out the window at the garden where sunlight falls in golden patches on herbs and flowers. Each plant reminds me of growth, slow, patient, sometimes unnoticed. That's how change happens in people, too. I can still hear my son-in-law's voice, softer now, full of attention rather than mockery. His hands, once careless with food, now move deliberately, learning to respect not just ingredients but history and love. My daughter watches learning too, understanding that care and patience are far more important than speed or novelty. These quiet shifts, more than the meals themselves, are what will sustain our family for generations. There is a gentle satisfaction in witnessing someone evolve. Not through force or punishment, but through guidance, patience, and subtle insistence on respect. I remember the first night he asked for my recipe, the humility in his voice, the acknowledgement of what he had dismissed before. That moment, once so daunting, now feels like a turning point. Hunger, pride, and circumstance had intersected, revealing a path toward reconciliation. And through this, I understood that legacy isn't measured by how loudly others praise you, but by how carefully the knowledge and love you pass on are nurtured in those who choose to receive it. I close my notebook, softly, careful not to disturb the quiet that has settled over the house. In these pages are more than recipes, they are memories, lessons, and the invisible threads of generations carried in the subtle flavor of a well-tended dish. Some flavors cannot be measured, only felt patience. Humility, care, and love. That is the real secret ingredient, one that teaches more than words ever could. My son-in-law has tasted it slowly, reluctantly at first, and now with awareness. The family has begun to recognize it too. These are the moments that define the true power of connection, subtly transforming even the most awkward, strained relationships. As I stand and stretch the night air, brushing my face through the open window, I whisper a quiet acknowledgement of gratitude, not for the recognition of others, but for the endurance and wisdom that brought me here. Every moment of mockery, every pang of doubt, every small victory in patience has shaped not just the dishes I create, but the person I have become. This quiet victory is sweeter than any dessert, deeper than any stew, richer than any triumph won by loud applause. I think of my viewers, the people who sit in the dark watching, listening, and finding echoes of their own lives in these stories. I want them to feel what I feel, that small, quiet acts of patience, resilience, and care are often the truest measures of strength. Life is messy, relationships are delicate, and pride and humility often dance together in the kitchen of our hearts. But when we choose to teach with care, to feed with presence, and to nurture with intention, even the coldest, most skeptical hearts can be softened. So thank you to my subscribers, my supporters, and those who have followed along in this journey. I hope you find a moment tonight to reflect, to nurture, and to taste the subtle, invisible flavors of love and patience in your own lives. Because in the end, it's not about perfection, it's about presence. It's not about being understood immediately, but about being consistent in care. And sometimes the quietest lessons are the most enduring, leaving a mark not on the palate alone, but on the soul. Good night, my friends. Take care of your kitchens, your hearts, and the people who sit at your tables.